Most people picture the angel of death as a hooded figure wandering the alleys of ancient Egypt, marking doors at random. The truth is something else entirely. What happened that night demanded an impossible precision, identifying the exact firstborn of every family, from the pharaoh's palace to the cell of the last prisoner, without error, without exception. This is the story you were never told. Put the full scene in perspective, a scene almost no one describes to you completely. Egypt, late Bronze Age, around the 13th century before Christ. A civilization that had spent more than 1,500 years building pyramids, colossal temples, and walled cities. A nation that worshipped more than 2,000 catalogued deities, each with its own sanctuary, its priests, and its specific rituals. Among those gods, the pharaoh himself, considered the living incarnation of Horus on earth and future Osiris in the afterlife. That night, a single entity passed through that entire theological structure as if it were wet paper, grasped the human magnitude of what was about to happen. The records of the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 37, indicate that the Hebrew people numbered approximately 600,000 adult men of military age, not counting women, children, or the elderly. Modern demographic calculations push the total figure to between 2 million and 2.5 million people. The Egyptian population of the era, according to estimates by Egyptologists such as Kenneth Kitchen and Donald Redford, ranged between 3 and 5 million inhabitants distributed along the Nile Valley. What you are witnessing, then, is an event that simultaneously struck more than half the population of the most powerful empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. It all happened between midnight and dawn. The biblical text contains an ambiguity that translators rarely stop to explain. In Exodus chapter 11, verse 4, Yahweh declares in direct speech, "About midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt." The verb is in the first-person singular, but barely a chapter later, in Exodus 12, verse 23, a distinct figure appears. "For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you." A separate character emerges there, the destroyer, in the original Hebrew, ha-mashchit, the destroyer. This textual duality has generated more than 2,000 years of debate among rabbis, church fathers, and modern scholars. Examine the 3 principal documented interpretations. The first, upheld by the Targum Onkelos and by the majority of classical rabbinic tradition, holds that the destroyer was a specific executing angel, an entity dispatched by Yahweh with an exclusive mission. The second, defended by Rashi and by medieval commentators such as Ibn Ezra, suggests that the Mashchit was not a personal entity, but a generalized destructive force, a kind of pestilence with direction and purpose. The third, present in midrashic writings such as Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer and reinforced by the mystical Zohar, identifies the destroyer with a specific archangel, called in various sources Mashchit, Gabriel in his aspect of judgment, or even Samael in his role as cosmic executor. None of the 3 options softens what happened that night. Follow the immediately preceding context. For months, Egypt had endured 9 consecutive plagues. The waters of the Nile turned to blood, an ecological catastrophe that killed every living creature in the most important river of antiquity. Frogs emerging by the thousands from the marshes, invading kitchens, ovens, and beds. Lice and gnats covering people and animals in a suffocating cloud. Swarms of flies devouring the fields until the earth ran black. The pestilence of livestock, which wiped out entire herds and left the cattle economy in ruins. Festering boils on the skin of men and beasts, described with a clinical precision remarkable for the era. hail mixed with fire, which destroyed the flax and barley in the height of harvest season, the locusts, which finished off the surviving wheat and spelt in less than 48 hours, and finally, a palpable darkness for 3 consecutive days, a blackness so dense that the records describe it as a collective blindness, impossible to penetrate even with torches held inches from one's face. Each plague attacked a specific Egyptian god directly. The Nile was Hapi, the sun was Ra, the cattle were Apis, the harvests were the domain of Renenutet. The darkness humiliated Aten. Each blow was a precise theological declaration, but the pharaoh, incarnation of Horus, had not yet been touched personally until that night. Think about what it meant to be a firstborn in the society of the new kingdom of Egypt. He was not merely the eldest son. He was the heir to his father's trade, the continuer of the family name, the guardian of the ancestral cult, the recipient of the double portion of the inheritance. In the pharaoh's case, he was the next god in the line of succession, trained since childhood in the rites of the throne and in the protocols of the afterlife. The simultaneous death of all firstborns was not simply a family tragedy. It was the institutional collapse of an entire civilization in a single night. Calculate the approximate numbers based on demographic studies of pharaonic Egypt. A total population of between 3 and 5 million inhabitants, with a proportion of firstborn sons ranging from 1 per every 5 to 7 family members, accounting for extended families, slaves, and domestic animals counted as part of the household. The estimated number of human victims that night easily exceeds 700,000 people. Add the firstborn livestock, as the text of Exodus explicitly records, and the figure doubles: 700,000 deaths in less than 6 hours. To give you a sense of scale, consider that the Black Death of the 14th century killed roughly 25 million people across Europe, but over the course of 4 years. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 claimed approximately 50 million lives over 2 years. The night of the Exodus concentrated a number of deaths equivalent to the entire population of a major contemporary city like Boston or Seville, within a time span shorter than a modern transatlantic flight. And every one of those deaths followed a criterion of selection impossible for any known natural mechanism. Examine the specific instructions Moses transmitted to the Hebrew people. Exodus 12 establishes a detailed protocol of protection. Each family was to set apart a male lamb, without blemish, 1 year old, on the 10th day of the first month of the religious year. They kept it for 4 days under careful observation, examining it to confirm the complete absence of any defect. On the evening of the 14th day, they slaughtered it. The blood was collected in a basin and applied with a bunch of hyssop to the upper lintel and to the 2 side doorposts of each house's entrance. The resulting shape on each door produced 3 marks of blood. Ancient Jewish commentators noted, centuries later, that the spatial arrangement of those marks formed the Hebrew letter Chet, the first letter of the word Chaim, meaning life. Others saw in the combination an archaic Tor, a symbol of marking or sealing in the Canaanite alphabets of the 2nd millennium before Christ. Whatever the interpretation, the blood was a visual code the executor would recognize without any possibility of error. And here, the first unsettling question arises. If Yahweh himself was executing the judgment, as Exodus 11 verse 4 declares, why did he need a visual signal to identify the Hebrew houses? An omniscient God has no need of external markers. The existence of the blood code suggests that the actual executor was a subordinate entity, authorized to destroy everything not bearing the mark, incapable of discerning interior intentions. This is one of the strongest arguments in favor of interpreting the Mashchit as an entity distinct from Yahweh. Be present at the moment the order was transmitted. Moses, according to the records, summoned the elders of Israel and explained the procedure with ritual exactness. The precise hour of the sacrifice, the precise method of applying the blood, the absolute obligation not to leave the house until dawn. The preparation of the lamb roasted over fire, eaten with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. The specific attire for the meal, loins girded, sandals on their feet, staff in hand, eating in haste. Every detail seemed absurd. A people enslaved for 430 years, according to Exodus 12. Verse 40 was being instructed to dress for a journey no one could guarantee, to eat standing as though departure were imminent, to trust a mark of blood as the only protection against an entity that was about to kill more than half the firstborns of the most powerful empire in the region. Imagine the emotional state inside the Hebrew houses in the hours before midnight, entire families shut behind sealed doors, children frightened by the ritual and by the silence imposed upon them, mothers checking and rechecking the blood marks on the doorframes, fathers calculating whether the line applied with hyssop covered every necessary inch of wood. The smell of roasted lamb mixing with the sweat of fear and the dense aroma of bitter herbs. And outside, the unnatural silence of a city that had no idea what was approaching. Meanwhile, in the Egyptian households, everything continued with apparent normality. The firstborns of the wealthiest families slept on beds of cedar wood with pillows of fine linen. The sons of craftsmen rested on mats beside the household fire. The eldest children of foreign slaves, captured in military campaigns in Nubia and Canaan, slept in chains in the Pharaoh's dungeons, as Exodus 11 verse 5 explicitly states. And in the royal palace, the Pharaoh's firstborn, the future heir to the throne of the two lands, slept under the protection of the sacred amulets of Sekhmet, Bastet, and of the pyramid texts carved into the walls of his chamber. None of those amulets would work. Note the precise chronology. The Hebrew text uses the expression Jachatzot halayla, the dividing of the night, pointing to the exact midnight hour. It was not at the onset of night. It was not before dawn. It was at the precise midpoint, when the silence was deepest, when sleep was heaviest, when the natural alertness of the human body was at its lowest. And then, without thunder, without earthquake, without wind, without visible warning, it began. The first narrative record describes the Pharaoh's cry. Exodus 12 verse 30 states that Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. The Hebrew phrase is categorical. Ein Beit Asher Ein Sham met. Not a house where there was not one dead, without exception. Consider the houses that were struck. The house of the Pharaoh lost the heir to the throne. The houses of the nobles lost their firstborn sons. The future administrators of the provinces. The houses of the priests lost their successors in the temple rites. The houses of the soldiers lost the sons who would have continued the military career. The houses of the craftsmen lost the apprentices who would have inherited the trades. The houses of the farmers lost the eldest sons who would have worked the land the following year. The houses of foreign slaves lost even the few firstborns left to them after the decree of infant extermination recorded in Exodus 1, verse 22. And the pens lost the firstborn of the livestock. To give you a concrete sense of the economic dimension, the cattle herds of New Kingdom Egypt were estimated at around 1,200,000 head, according to administrative records from the Temple of Karnak. Sheep and goat flocks exceeded 3 million animals. Horses, recently introduced by the Hyksos, totaled roughly 40,000. The loss of firstborn animals represented a livestock collapse from which the Egyptian economy took decades to recover. But the true weight was not in the numbers. It was in the screams. Silence. And then, simultaneously, in hundreds of thousands of homes, the discovery. A mother touching the cold face of her son. A father trying to wake the heir who no longer responded. A younger brother asking why the eldest had not gotten up at his usual hour. A nursemaid realizing that the child in her arms had lost all warmth. Multiply that across more than 700,000 families, occurring within the same span of minutes. The collective sound of Egyptian mourning, according to the text, was the greatest ever heard in that land. The Hebrew phrase is emphatic. Vatehi tza'aka gedolah b'Mitzrayim, and there was a great cry in Egypt. The historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century after Christ in his work Jewish Antiquities, Book 2, Chapter 14, describes the night as a generalized chaos, with Egyptians fleeing their own homes as if the walls themselves were responsible for the deaths. Follow the Pharaoh's reaction. Exodus 12, verses 31 and 32, records the exact moment. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. He did not wait for dawn. He did not convene his advisers. He did not consult his priests. The words he spoke shattered 300 years of pharaonic protocol. Rise up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. Bless me also. Think about what those 3 words meant. The Pharaoh, considered a living god, incarnation of Horus, son of Ra, asking for blessing from the leader of a nation of slaves. It was the implicit acknowledgement of total theological defeat. The religious structure that sustained the legitimacy of the Egyptian throne had been destroyed in less than 6 hours, and ordinary Egyptians reacted with the same urgency. Exodus 12, verse 33, tells us that the Egyptians urged the people of Israel to hurry and leave the country, for they said, "We are all dead men." The Egyptian people spontaneously offered the Hebrews their ornaments of gold, silver, and fine clothing, as verse 35 records. This was not looting. It was a voluntary transfer of wealth, driven by the absolute terror that any further delay would bring more death. Calculate the approximate value of that transfer. Modern estimates, based on records of the average weight of Egyptian jewelry from the period and on the size of the Hebrew population, indicate that the people of Israel left Egypt carrying between 20 and 40 metric tons of gold and silver. For comparison, the complete treasure of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, weighed approximately 1.5 tons of gold. The Hebrews carried with them the equivalent of more than a dozen complete pharaonic treasures. And yet, the gold was not the prize. It was merely a byproduct of fear. A question then arises that few commentators explore. If the executor was a spiritual entity with supernatural powers of discernment, why did it need blood as a marker? The most coherent answer the Hebrew text allows lies in the theological principle of the law of blood, established in Leviticus 17, verse 11. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. The blood of the Lamb was not a magic code. It was the legal substitution of the protected human life. In every Hebrew household, technically, a firstborn had died that night. Only the firstborn who died was the lamb. The shed blood certified the substitution. The destroyer passed over because justice had already been carried out on another body. This is the understanding that Christianity would later take up in the image of the Lamb of God. Examine the available archaeological details. The tradition of Passover, observed annually by Jewish communities for more than 3,300 years, preserves the living memory of that night. The name of the festival, Pesach, comes from the Hebrew verb pasash, commonly translated as to skip over or to pass over. But the biblical philologist Umberto Cassuto, in his classic commentary on Exodus published in 1951, demonstrated that the verb can also mean to protect. in to spread wings over, or to place oneself in defense of. Yahweh, on this reading, was not merely passing over. He was positioning himself as a shield between the destroyer and the households marked by blood. The distinction seems subtle. It changes the entire theology of the account. This is not a lethal entity being redirected by a magical mark. This is a divine shield interposing itself between the executor of judgment and the people protected by the blood of the substitute. And if Yahweh was the shield, that confirms that the destroyer was a separate entity. Consider the later Jewish traditions that attempted to identify the executor. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, a midrashic compilation from the 8th century after Christ, suggests the destroyer was the angel Gabriel, acting in his aspect of the fire of judgment. The Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah compiled by Moses de Leon in the 13th century, identifies the executor with the Sephirah of Gevurah, cosmic severity personified. The Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Shabbat, page 87, mentions a generic destroying angel acting under direct command. Christian traditions followed similar paths. Origen of Alexandria, in the 3rd century, suggested the executor was an angel of judgment with no revealed name. Augustine, in his work Questions on the Heptateuch, interpreted the episode as a direct manifestation of divine justice mediated by angelic agents. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologica, Part 1, Question 114, held that the collective punishments of the Old Testament were carried out by authorized angels, never directly by the unreachable divinity. No tradition chose to reveal the name, perhaps because the name was never what mattered. What mattered was the principle. There is an executing entity, authorized, precise, incapable of error, bound by a code of blood that determines who lives and who dies. The personal identity of the executor remains secondary in relation to the mechanism of protection that any person could activate by obeying the instructions received. Look at the subsequent effects on the Egyptian Empire. The dating most widely accepted by archaeologists, such as Bryant Wood and James Hoffmeyer, places the Exodus between 1440 and 1250 BC, depending on the chronology considered. The administrative records of New Kingdom Egypt show, precisely within that interval, an abrupt demographic decline, a clear succession crisis, and a deep reorganization of military and religious structures. The Ipufa Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian text discovered in 1828 and preserved today in the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, describes remarkably parallel scenes: rivers of blood, widespread famine, the death of firstborns, slaves departing with riches. Some Egyptologists reject the connection. Others consider it one of the most compelling extra-biblical pieces of evidence for a real event underlying the Exodus narrative. The debate remains open. What is not in debate is the internal transformation of the Hebrew people from that night forward. Consider the point carefully. Up to the moment of the Exodus, the Hebrews were an ethnic group in the process of definition, descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, enslaved for 4 centuries, with a fragmented cultural identity and a religion contaminated by elements of Egyptian polytheism. The night of the 10th plague marked the legal, religious, and national birth of Israel as a distinct people. The celebration of Passover was transformed into the primary marker of collective identity, repeated every year by more than 100 consecutive generations down to the present day. No other event in ancient history produced such long and uninterrupted ritual continuity. Now follow the march that came after the night of judgment. Exodus 12, verse 37, indicates that the people departed from Ramesses toward Succoth. The distance between the two cities, according to the modern geography of the eastern Nile Delta, is approximately 50 kilometers in a straight line. Considering 2 million people with animals, Carts, the elderly and children, the actual movement likely extended over several days, but the decision to depart and the initial movement occurred at the dawn following the judgment. An exodus of that demographic scale represents a logistical event equivalent to evacuating a city the size of Houston or Rome in less than 24 hours. For perspective, the largest forced migrations of the modern era, such as the partition of India in 1947, moved between 10 and 15 million people, but over the course of months. The departure from Egypt gathered more than 2 million people into motion in a single day, and no one stood in the way. Not a single Egyptian soldier blocked the road, no administrative official checked documents, no priest attempted to retain sacred objects. The entire apparatus of pharaonic Egypt was paralyzed by collective mourning. The men responsible for public security had lost their own firstborns. The civil administrators were burying their sons. The military officers were carrying the bodies of their heirs. The entire machinery of the empire ground to a halt for precisely long enough for the Hebrew people to escape completely. Only afterward, days later, would the Pharaoh reassemble his army and pursue the Hebrews toward the Red Sea. But that chapter is another story. What ended that night was far more than a succession crisis. What ended was the theological claim of New Kingdom Egypt to be the divinely established power of the Mediterranean. The Egyptian vision of the Pharaoh as incarnate God was dealt a mortal symbolic blow. No subsequent pharaoh would ever again attain the absolute religious status of his predecessors. Egyptologists note, in the records of the period immediately following the Exodus, a proliferation of religious reforms, attempts to fuse cults, theological movements scrambling to restore the legitimacy of royal authority. None of it worked completely. The blow suffered that night left marks that extended across centuries. Examine, finally, the question at the heart of this account. Who was the angel of death who killed all the firstborns of Egypt in a single night? The most honest answer the biblical text permits is this. The executor was an entity subordinate to Yahweh, called in Hebrew Hamashchit, the destroyer. It has no personal name revealed in the canonical scriptures. Post-biblical traditions assign it various identities, from Gabriel to Samael, but none of those identifications appear in the text of Exodus itself. What the text does reveal is the nature of the entity: absolute precision, strict adherence to a blood-based code of protection, total submission to a higher authority, zero margin of error in identifying its victims. And it reveals something deeper still. The destroyer did not act from arbitrary cruelty. It acted as the executor of a judgment 430 years of accumulated injustice had been building toward. 4 centuries of systematic slavery. Decades of state-decreed infant extermination under a previous pharaoh. Generations of an entire people subjected to forced labor on colossal construction projects, the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. The night of the 10th plague did not inaugurate a cycle of violence. It closed a cycle of 4 centuries of prior violence, and it offered simultaneously a path of escape. The blood of the lamb on the doorframes was a universal offer. Any household, Hebrew or Egyptian, that applied the mark would be protected. The choice to accept or reject the instruction rested with each head of family. Ancient Midrashic records suggest that some fearful Egyptians, aware of the decree, took shelter in Hebrew houses and applied the blood. Those Egyptians would later join the Exodus as part of the mixed multitude mentioned in Exodus 12, verse 38. The protection was never ethnic. It was always behavioral. Whoever obeyed the instruction of the blood lived. Whoever ignored it died. And here emerges the Christological connection the Church Fathers noted from the earliest centuries. Paul of Tarsus, in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 7, wrote, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. John the Baptist, according to the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 29, identified Jesus with the words, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." The book of Revelation, chapter 5, presents the slaughtered lamb as the central figure of the heavenly liturgy. The Christian reading of the Exodus episode transforms it into prefiguration. The blood of the Passover lamb applied to the doorframes prefigures the blood of the Messiah applied symbolically to human lives. The destroyer passing over prefigures the spiritual death that is escaped through the substitution of the crucified Christ. The departure from Egypt prefigures humanity's spiritual departure from the captivity of its own existence. Whatever theological interpretation you hold, one documentary truth remains intact. In a single night of the second millennium before Christ, an entity whose name the scriptures never disclosed executed the most selective and largest-scale judgment recorded in any ancient text. More than 700,000 human victims, without error, without a single victim outside the criterion, without delay, and no one, across 33 centuries, has offered a fully coherent natural explanation for what happened. New Kingdom Egypt was never the same civilization after that night. The Hebrew people were never again merely an enslaved ethnic group. The religious history of the Mediterranean was never again separated from the memory of the Exodus, and the question of the exact identity of the destroyer remains open, carefully preserved in the silence of the sacred text, as though the name of the executor mattered less than the principle that night established once and for all. The principle is simple. There is a judgment, there is a substitution, there is a mark of blood, and there is a choice. That choice at some point arrives at the door of every generation.